Welcome back. You're watching Invest Africa, where this week we're taking a closer look at Zimbabwe as a business and investment destination. And Suresh, I'm going to be bringing you into the conversation in just a bit. But before we do, George really wanting to jump in here and defend Zimbabwe's case. I mean, George, ahead of the break, we had Martyn's questioning the sustainability of a policy like this when it comes to long-term investment prospects in the country. Yes,
I think the key word from my view, I think when Martyn touched on this, the word is sustainability. Sustainability does not mean FDI coming into a country without the proper partnership, because you need to embrace the locals in one form or the other. And I think this is the key issue that has not been understood, and it's important. And it doesn't apply for Zimbabwe only. It applies across the whole world. You cannot go as a Zimbabwean, I go to Canada and I want to go and control the mining sector in Canada. It's not going to happen. It's not sustainable. Now, what I think the Zimbabwe is going through is a process of trying to ensure that it is a very sustainable business environment process. Obviously, the implementation is a process. It's not an overnight process, but if you look at the deals that have been done right now, immediately after the deals have been done, Zimplats has come out. They are going to complete their phase 2 project and invest an additional $462 million. PPC has come out. They've committed another $200 million to actually put in a second cement plant. Mimosa is working on its expansion plan. So almost, if you look at it in terms of facts, there's been actually more comfort by foreign investors after they have completed compliance with the system. Of course, those are the two sides to the argument. Suresh, which side of the fence are you going to be sitting on? Bearing in mind that you're sitting closer to Martyn.
Yeah, I'm cognizant of that. I think just to carry on George's point, I think he does make a point, that there are policy decisions that are not necessarily only characteristic of Zimbabwe. In Angola, for example, you have to be a 49% stakeholder to become part of to buy a bank. So I don't think that there's a difference. The key issue, however, and I think, is that I don't think that Zimbabwe have done a good job at the PR that they're supposed to have done. Yeah. In terms of wooing foreign investors, number one. I think number two is that in Africa, with a GDP growth now between 5.5 and 6%, there are a number of other competing African countries that are competing for the same investment from private or from foreign investors, like Zimbabwe. And as a result, there has to be a sustainable competitive advantage why one investor would want to invest in Zimbabwe as opposed to investing in Angola or Ghana or other higher GDP, or Mozambique for that matter. And those are the key factors that Zimbabwe will need to take into account. And certainly I think there are challenges, but there are also opportunities where the government of Zimbabwe and the people of Zimbabwe have to be looking to making Zimbabwe more competitive. Especially if you've got indigenization, yes, on the one hand, but then on the other hand, privatization of old state-owned enterprises as well. You've got to be wooing investors in a certain way. Let's take a look at something else that Zimbabwe has come under scathing criticism for, and that the levels of corruption, both within the public and private sectors of the economy. Just how worrying are corruption levels over in Zimbabwe for you, Martyn? Because on the one hand, it contributes to government deficits, resulting in the raising of taxes. On the other hand, it erodes state funds that could be used towards the development and building the country.
It comes back to what I said earlier about ease of doing business. The World Bank report that tells a large part of the story. For me, it's always a question. This is Zimbabwe, this is our own country, South Africa, this is many other countries in the region. It's the state must be enabling ultimately for business, not predatory. Where does Zimbabwe currently sit? And unfortunately, we see that there's, governments most of the time, especially in this part of the world, are not very pro-business, do not create that policy certainty we spoke about, and do not have these long-term sort of sustainable, George's word, sustainable vision around growing the economy. The question we have to pose, I think, making it relevant this conversation, particularly the indigenization transactions you mentioned, Lisha, is that, and we pose this question in a post-Americana South Africa, is the country really going to develop and progress through politically forced equity transfers? Let's ask the question for South Africa. Let's ask the question for Zimbabwe, longer term. Ultimately, it's what you touched upon, is how does the state create this enabling environment and seek competitiveness? It's about a competitiveness of the economy rather than sort of pushing the deck chairs around in terms of equity and that state enforced. That's why I'm somewhat pessimistic.
George, your response?
Yes,
there?
yeah. I think my view is that he mentioned the key issue that I know definitely is a challenge for Zimbabwe, which is the PR, because right now most of the internationally communicated news on Zimbabwe is on the negative side, right? And hardly or very few do you see things on the positive side. And most of the positives are on the business across the board. I mean, since dollarization, our economy has grown at a compounded annual growth rate of almost 25%. We have averaged GDP growth at about 7%. Inflation has been below 5%. And if you look at indigenization, there's been all these transactions that have happened. You look at infrastructure, you look at telecoms, you look at internet access. Almost across most of the ministries, there's been growth and significant development. You come on the ground, you see a totally different country than what you read from outside. So I think there's need for a fair balance for investors to clearly understand what is the opportunity in Zimbabwe.
Suresh, you know, as investors try and understand this operating and investment environment a bit better, I mean, since dollarization, George highlighted, you know, we've seen this growth come in. Investors also wanting reassurance that Zimbabwe will not reinstate its own currency, that it will continue to operate with an operational multi-currency system. Just how much of a swing factor is that for you?
Well, I think it's been significant, and you can see that the monetary intervention by the central bank since the coalition have had a significant impact on the economy. I think that the banking sector has been able to develop and been able to grow, and I think this has been one of the catalysts for seeing the GDP growth that we're seeing, as well as looking at the banking sector growth. I think the key issue that we now need to see is the next phase. How do we retool those particular industries? And I think empowerment is not necessarily a bad thing. We've seen that in South Africa. I think, again, the emphasis is on how do we position that empowerment to benefit the country and to benefit the investors.
What the government has been coming through with, Martin, are bilateral investment agreements that are being actively promoted. I mean, the country's already signed such an agreement with South Africa, and it protects investments from compulsory expropriation, effectiveness of mechanisms like this. How does that rate in your books?
Well, certainly it's a positive, of course, but should we be having to do that in the first place? I think what we're going to see in a medium term, perhaps, and I ultimately believe that the state's economic destination, in terms of true development, there's a difference between business opportunities and true development, people's livelihoods improving over a long period of time and sustainably so, is that, we talk about competitiveness, but if there's a real political solution, I would sort of argue more towards a real political change coming through in Zimbabwe. We will see perhaps then a British government stabilization fund for Zimbabwe. We will see South African capital, again, countering the negative perceptions and really investing, rebuilding infrastructure back into the country. We'll even see, and I would argue, contrary to often perception, is that Chinese capital will be a lot more bullish towards Zimbabwe than what it is currently. Many Chinese banks won't go near Zimbabwe because it's too high risk beyond the policy banks. And ultimately, most importantly, something we spoke about, is the return of very educated Zimbabwean talent from Johannesburg, from London, wherever it may be, back to Harare, back to Bulawayo. Then we're going to see a real turnaround. So medium term, politics allowing, I'm optimistic.
Well, gentlemen, let's leave it there. Thanks so much for having joined us today. Of course, that's all we have time for on this edition of Invest Africa. George MANYERE from BRAINWORKS Capital Management, Martyn Davies from Frontier Advisory, and SURESH CHAYTOO RMB, all with us at the desk unpacking the investment climate of Zimbabwe. Until next time, from me, Alicia Seckham, it's goodbye.